So there I was, sitting on my grandfather's old cabin porch with my morning coffee, watching the sunrise paint the valley in shades of gold. 3 months into my digital nomad experiment, and I'd finally found peace in this forgotten corner of Montana. The cabin wasn't much to look at: weathered logs, a tin roof that sang in the rain, and windows that had seen better decades. But it was mine, inherited fair and square, along with what I thought was just the surrounding acre. That's when she appeared. Picture this: a woman in her 50s, marching up my dirt road like she owned the place, clipboard clutched to her chest like a holy relic. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tight it could have been used as a suspension bridge, and she wore the kind of smile that screamed, "I'm about to ruin your day." Behind her trailed a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Probably her husband. Poor bastard. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying that special blend of artificial sweetness and barely contained rage that only comes from years of HOA board meetings. "Are you the person currently occupying this structure?" Structure. Not cabin, not home, structure. Like I was some squatter living in a condemned building. I set down my coffee and stood up slowly, partly because I'd been sitting for a while, and partly because I wanted to make her wait. "That would be me," I said, matching her fake smile with one of my own. "And you are?" "Margaret Hawthorne, president of Whispering Pines Homeowners Association." She said it like she was announcing herself as the Queen of England. "We need to discuss some irregularities with your property." Now, I should mention that I'm not exactly your typical mountain hermit. Sure, I look the part: flannel shirt, work boots, 5 days of stubble, but I spent the last decade as a corporate lawyer specializing in real estate. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd come here to escape exactly this type of bureaucratic nonsense, only to have it follow me up a mountain. Irregularities? I raised an eyebrow. Such as? Margaret's smile grew wider, which somehow made it even more terrifying. "Well, for starters, this cabin doesn't appear on any of our approved architectural plans. The color scheme is completely wrong for our community standards, and don't even get me started on that garden." She gestured dismissively at my grandfather's vegetable patch, which admittedly looked like it had been planned by someone who thought organization was a dirty word. I glanced at the garden, a chaotic mix of tomatoes, herbs, and what might have been carrots if you squinted. My grandfather had always said the best gardens grew wild, like the man himself. Community standards? The Whispering Pines community guidelines clearly state that all structures must maintain a cohesive aesthetic. Earth tones only, approved by the architectural committee. Your cabin is. She paused, searching for the right word to express her disgust. Rustic. The way she said rustic made it sound like a communicable disease. Also, she continued, consulting her clipboard like it contained the secrets of the universe, you haven't submitted any landscaping plans. Your mailbox doesn't meet regulation height requirements, and I don't see any HOA dues payments in our records. We'll need to rectify these violations immediately. I took a sip of my coffee, buying time while my brain processed this delicious absurdity. HOA dues? For what exactly? Road maintenance, community beautification, administrative costs. She rattled off the list like she'd memorized it for a test. The annual fee is $2,400, plus a $500 initiation fee for new residents, plus penalties for existing violations. I calculate your total outstanding balance at approximately $3,200. $3,000. For the privilege of having Margaret tell me what color to paint my grandfather's cabin. I set my coffee mug down on the porch railing and crossed my arms. That's interesting, Margaret. Tell me, what exactly does this HOA maintain around here? She blinked, clearly not expecting questions. Well, the common areas, of course. Which common areas would those be? I gestured around us. The nearest house was barely visible through the trees, at least half a mile down the valley. I don't see any community pools, parks, or even sidewalks. Her husband, I was now certain that's who the poor guy was, shifted uncomfortably behind her. He caught my eye and gave me a look that clearly said, "I'm sorry for my wife's existence." "The roads," Margaret said firmly. "We maintain the roads." I glanced at the pothole-riddled dirt track that barely qualified as a road. If this was maintained, I'd hate to see what abandoned looked like. This road, all the roads in the community. Her voice was getting that edge that suggested I was testing her patience. Good. Look, Mr. Davis. Jake Davis. Mr. Davis, you can't just move into a community and ignore the established rules. We have standards here. Property values to maintain. She looked at my cabin like it was personally offensive to her sensibilities. This rustic aesthetic brings down the whole neighborhood. Now, I'll admit, the cabin wasn't winning any architectural awards, but it had character, history, and most importantly, it was paid for. Unlike, I suspected, Margaret's McMansion down the valley with its perfect lawn and regulation beige siding. I understand your concerns, I said, putting on my best lawyer voice, calm, reasonable, and utterly unmovable. But I'm going to need to see some documentation before I write any checks. Property deeds, HOA charter, that sort of thing. Margaret's smile faltered for just a second. Documentation? Well, yes. You can't just walk onto someone's property and demand money without proper legal foundation. I pulled out my phone. I'd also like to verify the boundaries of this HOA's jurisdiction, just to make sure we're all on the same page. The boundaries are clearly established, she snapped, her fake sweetness evaporating. This entire valley is part of Whispering Pines. The entire valley? I raised both eyebrows this time. That's quite extensive. Look, Mr. Davis, I don't have time for games. Margaret's true personality was starting to show through the cracks in her diplomatic facade. You have 30 days to bring your property into compliance, or we'll be forced to take legal action. Legal action? I couldn't help but grin. What kind of legal action? Liens, fines, court orders. She was warming up now, clipboard waving like a battle flag. We have the authority to force compliance with community standards. I nodded thoughtfully. And this authority comes from? The HOA charter, obviously. Right, the charter. The one I'd like to see. Margaret's face was starting to match the color of my flannel shirt. I don't carry copies of legal documents around with me. Of course not. Tell you what, why don't you email me a copy? Along with the property survey showing exactly where your HOA's jurisdiction begins and ends. I pulled out a business card. Yes, I still carried them. Old habits die hard, and handed it to her. My contact information. She snatched the card and squinted at it. I watched her expression change as she read Davis & Associates, real estate law. You're a lawyer, she said, like I'd just told her I was a serial killer. Guilty as charged. I grinned. Specializing in property disputes, zoning issues, and HOA governance. Funny how life works out, isn't it? Margaret's husband chose that moment to tug on her sleeve. Honey, maybe we should. Not now, Gerald. She whirled on him with the fury of a woman whose perfectly planned intimidation had just backfired spectacularly. Poor Gerald. I made a mental note to buy him a beer if I ever ran into him at the local bar. After Margaret and Gerald retreated down the mountain, her stomping, him apologizing to the trees, I did what any reasonable person would do. I opened my laptop and started digging. The beauty of being a property lawyer is that you develop a sixth sense for bullshit, and Margaret's entire performance reeked of it. HOAs don't just materialize out of thin air. They require legal documentation, proper filing, and most importantly, they need property owners to actually agree to join them. My first stop was the county records office website. Bless the digital age. What used to require a trip to the courthouse now took 5 minutes and a decent internet connection. I pulled up the property records for my grandfather's cabin and nearly choked on my coffee. The deed didn't show 1 acre. It showed 847 acres. 847 acres of pristine Montana wilderness, stretching from my cabin all the way down to the valley floor and up the opposite ridge. My grandfather, that sly old fox, had apparently been buying up parcels for decades, quietly assembling what amounted to a small kingdom in the middle of nowhere. But here's the kicker. According to the county records, most of the Whispering Pines community sat on land that was technically mine. The roads Margaret was so proud of maintaining? Mine. The common areas she mentioned? Also mine. Hell, Even the little creek that ran through the valley was on my property. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. My grandfather had never mentioned any of this. To me, he was just the eccentric old man who lived in a cabin and told stories about the old days. Apparently, he'd also been a real estate mogul with a sense of humor that extended beyond the grave. But why hadn't anyone noticed this before? How had an HOA been formed on private property without the owner's knowledge or consent? The answer came when I dug deeper into the HOA's formation documents. Whispering Pines Homeowners Association had been established 5 years ago, 2 years after my grandfather's death. The paperwork listed him as a founding member, complete with a forged signature that wouldn't fool a blind notary. Someone had been very busy and very sloppy. I spent the next 3 hours mapping out the timeline. My grandfather dies. The estate goes into probate, which took forever because he'd been too stubborn to hire a proper lawyer. And while everything was tied up in legal limbo, a group of local residents decided to form an HOA. They assumed the old hermit's property would either be sold to developers or abandoned, so they helped themselves to his signature and claimed authority over his land. The more I read, the angrier I got. This wasn't just bureaucratic overreach. It was fraud. Someone had forged my grandfather's signature on legal documents and used his supposed consent to claim authority over his property. My property. My phone buzzed. Email from Margaret, sent from an address that was probably older than the internet itself. The subject line read, "Urgent. Whispering Pines community violations." I opened it, expecting more threats and demands. Instead, I found a scanned copy of what looked like a legal document. The HOA charter, as promised, along with a property survey that showed the entire valley under HOA jurisdiction and a bill for $3,200 in fees and fines. But here's where Margaret made her first big mistake. She'd included a copy of the deed she thought proved the HOA's authority over my property. The problem was, it wasn't my deed. It was a deed for a completely different parcel, about 3 miles south of my cabin. Someone had either given her the wrong document, or she'd grabbed the first thing that looked official. I leaned back and laughed. Actually laughed out loud, startling a squirrel that had been watching me through the window. Margaret wasn't just wrong. She was spectacularly, legally, provably wrong. And she'd just handed me the evidence to prove it. This was going to be fun. I spent the next week doing what I do best, building an airtight legal case while appearing to do absolutely nothing. From Margaret's perspective, I was probably just some city lawyer trying to figure out how to weasel out of paying HOA fees. She had no idea I was assembling a legal nuclear weapon. First, I confirmed the property boundaries with a professional survey. 847 acres, just like the deed said. The surveyor, a local guy named Pete who'd known my grandfather, wasn't even surprised. Old Jake was always buying up land. Pete told me, scratching his graying beard. Said he wanted to keep the developers out. Guess he did a pretty good job. Did he ever mention an HOA? Pete snorted. Jake? He wouldn't join a homeowners association if they paid him. Said it was like putting the inmates in charge of the asylum. Wise man, my grandfather. Next, I dove into the HOA's financial records, which were surprisingly easy to access thanks to state sunshine laws. Turns out, Whispering Pines Homeowners Association was not exactly a model of fiscal responsibility. They'd been collecting dues for 5 years, but had precious little to show for it. The road maintenance budget had somehow been spent on Margaret's landscaping, and the administrative costs seemed to consist mainly of expensive dinners and conference trips to resort towns. But the real smoking gun was in the meeting minutes. 5 years of monthly board meetings, and not once, not even once, had anyone questioned whether they actually had the legal authority to claim jurisdiction over my grandfather's property. They'd simply assumed it was abandoned and helped themselves. I was particularly amused by one entry from 3 years ago, motion passed to increase fines for non-compliance with architectural standards. President Hawthorne noted that the rustic cabin on Ridgeline Road continues to be an eyesore, but appears to be unoccupied. Unoccupied. Margaret had been complaining about my cabin for 3 years without bothering to find out who owned it. While I was building my case, Margaret was building hers. She'd apparently decided that I was a troublemaker who needed to be dealt with swiftly and decisively. The harassment started small, a nasty gram about my non-compliant mailbox, followed by a formal citation for unauthorized vegetation, my grandfather's vegetable garden. Then she escalated. I came home from a supply run to find a bright orange notice taped to my door. Violation, unpermitted structure. You have 72 hours to obtain proper building permits or face fines up to $500 per day. Unpermitted structure. For a cabin that had been built in 1967, 40 years before Whispering Pines HOA even existed. I called the county building department, just for laughs. The conversation went exactly as expected. Permits for what now? The clerk sounded confused. A cabin built in 1967. Sir, we don't require retroactive permits for structures built before current codes went into effect. Who told you that you needed permits? The HOA. Long pause. Sir, HOAs don't have authority over building permits. That's a county function. I thanked him and hung up, then took a photo of the violation notice. Evidence for the growing pile. But Margaret wasn't done. Oh no, she was just getting started. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of chainsaws. I stumbled outside in my pajamas and bare feet to find a three-man crew cutting down trees at the edge of my property. Not just any trees. Old growth pines that had been standing since before Margaret was born. Hey, I shouted over the noise. What the hell are you doing? The crew chief shut off his saw and walked over, looking uncomfortable. Sorry, sir. We're clearing vegetation that's been deemed a fire hazard. By who? The Homeowners Association. We got a work order signed by. He consulted his clipboard, Margaret Hawthorne. I looked at the trees they'd already cut. Beautiful, healthy pines that posed about as much fire hazard as a swimming pool. Did anyone tell you this is private property? The man's face went pale. Private property? But the work order said. The work order is worth less than the paper it's printed on. I pulled out my phone. I'm calling the sheriff. 20 minutes later, Deputy Martinez arrived to find me standing in my pajamas, surveying the destruction while the tree crew packed up their equipment in a hurry. Martinez was a young guy, probably new to the job, but he had the good sense to take photos and ask the right questions. So let me get this straight, he said, reviewing his notes. The HOA ordered tree removal on your private property without your permission? That's about the size of it. And you've got the deed to prove ownership? I handed him a copy. He looked it over, whistled softly, and shook his head. Ma'am, he said into his radio, I'm going to need to speak with Margaret Hawthorne. Margaret arrived within minutes, Gerald trailing behind her like a reluctant shadow. She'd obviously dressed for battle, power suit, fresh makeup, and her clipboard polished to a high shine. Deputy Martinez, she said, extending her hand like she was greeting an old friend. I'm so glad you're here. This man has been causing nothing but trouble for our community. Martinez looked at me in my flannel pajamas and work boots, then at Margaret in her $1,000 suit, and I could see him making calculations. Ma'am, I understand you ordered tree removal on this property? Absolutely. Those trees were a clear fire hazard, and as HOA president, I have the authority to order removal of dangerous vegetation. She said it with complete confidence, like she was citing established law. And you got permission from the property owner? Margaret's smile faltered slightly. The property is part of our community. We don't need individual permission for community safety measures. Ma'am, this is private property. You can't order work done on private property without the owner's consent. Private property? Margaret laughed, but it sounded forced. Deputy, I think there's been some confusion. This entire valley is part of Whispering Pines community. We have the legal authority. Actually, I interrupted. No, you don't. I handed Martinez another document, the property survey I'd commissioned. He looked it over, his eyebrows climbing toward his hairline. Ma'am, he said to Margaret, according to this survey, this property extends well beyond just the cabin area. It looks like most of the valley. Margaret snatched the survey from his hands and stared at it. I watched her face go through several interesting color changes as the implications sank in. This is impossible, she whispered. The county records are public information, I said helpfully. Feel free to verify it yourself. But the HOA charter. She was flipping through her clipboard frantically. We have documentation. Forged documentation, I said. My grandfather never signed anything agreeing to HOA jurisdiction. In fact, he died 2 years before your association was even formed. Martinez was taking notes furiously. Sir, are you saying the HOA was formed without proper authority? I'm saying someone forged my grandfather's signature on legal documents and used it to claim authority over his property. That's fraud, deputy. Criminal fraud. Margaret's face had gone from red to pale to a sickly shade of green. Now wait just a minute. No, Margaret, you wait. I was done being polite. You've been harassing me for weeks, claiming authority you don't have over property you don't own. You've imposed fines, threatened legal action, and now you've trespassed on my land and destroyed my trees. That's harassment, fraud, trespassing, and destruction of property. Gerald chose that moment to tug on his wife's sleeve again. Honey, maybe we should call our lawyer. Shut up, Gerald, Margaret snapped, then seemed to realize she'd just publicly berated her husband in front of a police officer. I mean, this is all a misunderstanding. Oh, it's a misunderstanding, all right, I agreed. You misunderstood who owns this valley. Martinez finished his notes and looked up. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to provide documentation showing your authority to order work on this property. And sir, he turned to me. You'll need to file a formal complaint if you want to pursue charges. Already prepared, I said, pulling out another folder. Trespassing, destruction of property, fraud, and harassment. I've got 5 years of documentation. Margaret was staring at the survey like it might spontaneously combust. This can't be right. We've been operating as a legitimate HOA for 5 years. We have members. We collect dues. We maintain. You maintain what exactly? I gestured around us. The roads are falling apart. There are no common areas, and you've been using the dues to pay for your personal landscaping. What exactly are people paying for? Community standards. Margaret's voice was rising. Property values. We maintain the character of the neighborhood. What neighborhood? There are maybe a dozen houses in this entire valley, and half of them are on my property. Martinez looked like he was getting a headache. Folks, I think we need to take this downtown. Ma'am, you'll need to come with me to answer some questions about the tree removal. I want to speak to your supervisor, Margaret demanded. This is clearly some kind of conspiracy. Ma'am, you ordered work on private property without permission. That's trespassing and destruction of property. We need to sort this out properly. As Martinez loaded Margaret into his patrol car, Gerald following in their Mercedes, looking like he wanted to disappear, I surveyed the damage to my trees. 3 beautiful pines, probably 70 years old, reduced to stumps and sawdust. But you know what? It was worth it. Because Margaret had just handed me the perfect example of HOA overreach, and I had a deputy sheriff as a witness. This was about to get very interesting. News travels fast in a small mountain community, especially when it involves the HOA president getting arrested for trespassing. By the time I made it to the grocery store the next day, I'd become something of a local celebrity. You're the guy who got Margaret Hawthorne arrested? The clerk, a kid who couldn't have been more than 20, looked at me with something approaching awe. She got herself arrested? I corrected. I just called the sheriff when I found people cutting down my trees. Man, I wish I could have seen her face when she realized. He trailed off, grinning. I was beginning to understand that Margaret wasn't exactly beloved in the community. Over the next few days, I heard stories that would have made my lawyer's heart sing if I wasn't already living them. There was Bob Martinez, no relation to the deputy, whose workshop had been deemed aesthetically non-compliant because it wasn't beige enough. Margaret had fined him $200 a month for 2 years until he finally painted it the approved color. There was Susan Chun, who'd been cited for unauthorized landscaping because she'd planted native wildflowers instead of Margaret's preferred grass lawn. The fine was still accruing at $50 a month. And there was elderly Mr. Peterson, whose crime was owning a pickup truck that Margaret felt was inappropriate for the community aesthetic. She'd been trying to force him to park it behind his house for 3 years. Every conversation revealed new layers of Margaret's creative interpretation of HOA authority. She'd been running Whispering Pines like her personal fiefdom, and the residents had been too isolated or intimidated to fight back. But here's the thing about small communities. Once people start talking, they don't stop. And once they realized that Margaret's authority was as real as unicorns, they got angry. Very angry. I got my first hint of the brewing rebellion when Bob Martinez knocked on my door, hat in hand and fire in his eyes. "Jake," he said, "I heard what happened with your trees. I also heard you're a lawyer." "That's right." "Well, I've been paying HOA dues for 5 years, and I want to know if I can get my money back." Before I could answer, Susan Chin's car pulled up. Then Mr. Peterson's ancient Ford. By sunset, I had 14 angry residents on my porch, all with the same story: years of harassment, bogus fines, and dues payments for services that didn't exist. "She told me the HOA was mandatory," Susan said, clutching a folder full of citations, "that I had to join when I bought my house. She said if I didn't pay dues, they'd put a lien on my property," Bob added. "She fined me for having Christmas lights up past January 1st, Mr. Peterson grumbled. "Said it violated the community charter." I looked at this collection of decent people who'd been bullied and intimidated by Margaret's imaginary authority, and I made a decision that would have made my grandfather proud. "Tell you what," I said, "how about we form a class action lawsuit?" The cheer that went up could probably be heard in the next county. Over the next week, I turned my cabin into unofficial legal headquarters for the Whispering Pines Liberation Front, Bob's suggestion, and I loved it. We documented 5 years of fraudulent fines, harassment, and misuse of funds. The HOA had collected over $80,000 in dues from residents who'd been told membership was mandatory, then spent it on everything except actual community maintenance. Margaret's landscaping bills alone totaled $15,000. Her conference expenses, trips to luxury resorts supposedly for HOA training, came to another $12,000. The rest had disappeared into a maze of administrative costs that seemed to consist mainly of expensive dinners and Margaret's personal legal fees. But the real coup de grace came when I subpoenaed the HOA's insurance records. Turns out, Whispering Pines Homeowners Association had never actually existed as a legal entity. Margaret had never filed the proper paperwork with the state, never registered as a corporation, and never obtained the insurance required for HOA operations. She'd been running a fake HOA for 5 years, collecting real money from real people, and using it as her personal piggy bank. When I called the state attorney general's office, the investigator who took my call actually laughed. "Let me get this straight," he said. "She forged documents to create fake authority over private property, collected money under false pretenses, and used the funds for personal expenses? That's about the size of it. And she did this for 5 years. 5 years and counting. And nobody noticed? Small community. People trusted her. Well, they're about to get a very expensive lesson in due diligence. We'll be in touch." Margaret's world came crashing down on a Tuesday morning in late September. I was sitting on my porch, watching the aspens turn gold and enjoying the peace that comes with absolute legal victory, when Gerald's Mercedes came crawling up the mountain road. Poor Gerald looked like he'd aged a decade in the past month. Margaret, on the other hand, looked like she was ready for war. Her hair was still pulled back in that aggressive ponytail. Her clipboard was still clutched like a weapon, but there was something desperate in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Mr. Davis," she said, marching up to my porch with Gerald trailing behind like a whipped dog. "We need to talk." "Good morning, Margaret." "Gerald." I nodded to each of them. "Coffee." "I don't want your coffee," Margaret snapped. "I want this nonsense to stop." "What nonsense would that be?" "You know exactly what I mean. The lawsuit, the state investigation, turning the entire community against me." Her voice was getting shrill. "I built this HOA from nothing. I created property value, maintained standards, kept this place from turning into some kind of hillbilly commune." I gestured around at the pristine wilderness surrounding us. "Hillbilly commune? You know what I mean. Without proper oversight, communities deteriorate. Property values plummet. Standards disappear." She was working herself up into one of her righteous frenzies. "Someone has to maintain order. Order based on what authority? I have every right." Margaret, my voice cut through her building rant like a knife. You have no rights here. None. Zero. This is my property. These people never owed you a dime, and your HOA never legally existed. Gerald cleared his throat softly. Honey, maybe we should. Shut up, Gerald. She whirled on him with 5 years of accumulated fury. This is your fault. If you'd supported me instead of undermining me at every meeting. I never undermined you, Gerald said quietly, and for the first time since I'd met him, there was steel in his voice. I tried to warn you. I tried to tell you to check the legal documents. But you wouldn't listen. Margaret stared at him like he'd grown a second head. Apparently, Gerald fighting back was not part of her usual script. The State Attorney General's office has some questions for you, I said conversationally. Something about fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering. Oh, and the IRS is interested in those conference expenses you claimed as business deductions. Margaret's face went pale. Now see here. No, you see here. I stood up, and suddenly I wasn't the relaxed mountain hermit anymore. I was a lawyer who'd spent 10 years destroying people like Margaret in court. You've committed multiple felonies. You've defrauded dozens of people out of tens of thousands of dollars. You've harassed, intimidated, and bullied people for 5 years based on completely fabricated authority. I was protecting property values. You were feeding your ego and lining your pockets. I pulled out a folder. I always had folders now. Margaret had trained me well. $15,000 in landscaping for your personal property, charged to HOA funds. $12,000 in luxury resort trips. $20,000 in administrative expenses that seemed to consist mainly of expensive restaurants and personal legal fees. Margaret snatched the folder and flipped through it, her face cycling through various shades of red and white. These are legitimate business expenses for a business that never legally existed. Gerald stepped forward, and I saw something I'd never seen before. Pity in his eyes as he looked at his wife. Margaret, honey, it's over. The lawyer says we might avoid jail time if we cooperate, make restitution. Jail time. Margaret's voice cracked. I'm not going to jail over some misunderstanding. 47 counts of fraud is not a misunderstanding, I said. It's a career. The fight went out of her all at once. She literally deflated, clipboard dropping to her side, shoulders sagging like someone had cut her strings. What do you want? She whispered. Full restitution to every resident you defrauded. Public apology. Dissolution of the fake HOA. And you stay away from my property. I paused. Oh, and you're paying for my trees. The trees. 3 70-year-old pines. Replacement value, plus loss of use, plus punitive damages. My arborist estimates about $15,000. Margaret made a sound like a deflating balloon. Or, I continued, we can let the state handle it. I hear orange jumpsuits aren't really your color, but I could be wrong. Gerald put his hand on his wife's shoulder. Margaret, take the deal. She looked around the valley, my valley, like she was seeing it for the first time. Maybe she was. For 5 years, she'd seen it as her personal kingdom. Now she was realizing it had never been hers at all. Fine, she whispered. Fine. We'll make restitution. Excellent. I smiled. My lawyer will be in touch with the details. As they walked back to their car, I heard Gerald say, you know, honey, maybe we should consider that retirement community in Arizona, the one with the golf course. Margaret's response was too quiet to hear, but Gerald's shoulders relaxed for the first time since I'd met him. 6 months later, I got a postcard from Scottsdale. Gerald had written on the back, thanks for giving me my life back. The golf is terrible, but Margaret loves the HOA here. They actually know what they're doing. Gee. I laughed and pinned it to my wall, right next to the framed deed showing all 847 acres of my grandfather's final joke on the world. The valley is quiet now. The real residents, the ones who actually live here instead of trying to control it, wave when they drive by. My trees are growing back. And every morning, I sit on my porch with my coffee, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold, grateful for small-town justice and grandfathers with a sense of humor. Margaret never did get around to painting my cabin beige. Some victories are worth more than money. Thank you for being with us. Please share in the comments where you are watching from and whether you liked everything. and see you next time.